Good evening, beautiful people. Welcome to our Civics Sunday Night Live. My name is Talia. For those who don't know me, which I'm hoping a lot of folks do by now, I am a socialpreneur, community organizer, a community activist, revolutionary, philanthropist, humanitarian, all of those good things. But I'm super passionate about community engagement, youth development, and public policy. So last night for our Civic Saturday Night Live, we spoke about war on drugs. I'll just elaborate again that this platform was created to raise awareness, to get people to understand how politics does affect our everyday lives, everything that, our daily activities, and how every election is important and how every vote counts, right? So last night we talked about the war on drugs and how that affects us even to this day. And just the memo was for the elected officials, right? So just to give a recap, the war on drugs was a Contra connection. It came from Nicaragua, which is a country in Central America, in order to fund their military aid to win back the power in their country. They started to supply the United States with cocaine powder, which then turned into crack cocaine and tore down the black and brown communities tremendously, right? So that was just some background information. So tonight I wanted to kind of dive a little deeper into the war on drugs. So giving some more details. So the war on drugs was first proposed and first announced by President Richard Nixon in 1971, right? And the whole purpose was to reduce illegal drug trade in the states. And so by doing so, they implemented a bunch of drug policies. The huge effective policies that affected our communities and our people tremendously was mandatory minimum sentences for jail time and the stop and frisk searches, which we all are aware of to date. And so controlling drugs and minimizing the use of drugs and illegal trade was talked about like 50 plus years before it even really exploded. They tried something in 1914, then they tried something again in 1937, but it really took off in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan administration. And if you go back to our Civic Saturday Night Live, you'll hear all about it. And so in 1980, that was, again, when they really started to implement the stop and frisk searches and the mandatory minimums. Those particular drug policies that was supposed to decrease the drug trades in the United States, unfortunately targeted a specific demographic, which was our black and brown people, predominantly African Americans, right? And so in the 1980s, though drugs were trying to be under control in the States for 50 plus years, during that decade was when you seen a tremendous increase in incarceration, right? So in the States, we had an increase of 28% of citizens incarcerated for non-drug related offenses. Then for drug-related offenses, you see an increase in 126%. 126% folks that was incarcerated during the 80s for drug-related offenses. And a lot of that incarceration and that targeted war on drugs, that targeted demographic, was due to privatization of prisons, which was then diverting over to a for-profit industry, right? And so in the 1990s to the 2000s, there was 27% increase of blacks incarcerated. There was 7% of Hispanics, and there was actually 15% of whites incarcerated, all due to drug-related offenses in between the 1990s to the 2000s, which again was a direct result of the war on drugs that really took off in the 1980s. We even had an increase in our juveniles. From the year of 1985 to 1999, there was a 68% increase in juveniles in family court of folks that was under the age of 18. The African American population, particularly. Those stats are just for African American population. And then the crazy part is in 1986 to 1991, there was a 2-time increase in African American women than men. A 2-time increase. So it was crazy, man. It was crazy. It was crazy. And so, again, during this time was when we had the government basically in cahoots with the Central Americans and supplying the United States with powder cocaine, which then turned into crack cocaine, which tore down the black and brown communities. And their whole mindset was, as long as we were killing each other and allowing the drugs to kill us, like, they didn't step in at all. And in fact, even though they knew what they were doing and how they were supplying these drugs to us, they still then in turn started to incarcerate us. Something crazy. And that's why, though the war on drugs was geared towards reducing illegal drug trade in the United States, it's looked at as a racist act, as a racist campaign, because of who exactly was incarcerated, who exactly was affected by it, right? And so Nixon back in 1971, was the first again to announce it, and he called it the public enemy number one. But again, he was, in on it. So do your homework. Check out, you can Google everything now. Check out War on Drugs. You can also check out our Civics Saturday Night Live, where we gave a little more details of the background of the war on drugs. Again, that was when gangster rap was birthed, because folks were angry and they were speaking out about it, and it showed in their music, because that's the way artists express themselves. And so that was also when guns fled the streets in the hood tremendously. It was during this time. And so this, again, my whole purpose is to get us to understand like how every level of government affects us, right? And so though that was on a federal basis, obviously your local, your state, or your city, your state, and federal government all plays a part in that. So when we elect ethical people of integrity and morale, we get better results in the system. And so for our elected officials, this is why when you guys get in power, we need you to step up and make sure that you maintain that integrity that we voted you in for, that you don't let that power to get the best of you, that you are for the people. Because, I'll be honest, my generation, we're not really too thrilled about the system. It is not your party. It's none of that. We're looking at what have you done for the people? What do you plan to do? And so this message is for my elected officials, for my candidates. You guys have to help us help you. Help us to see hope in the system, to know that was the past and this is the future. And one last thing, because you guys know I like to keep it nice, sweet, and brief. Speaking of the future and believing in the system, there's actually a new legislation that's supposed to be proposed before the new year, which gives us about 2 weeks. And what that's supposed to do is reverse all of those drug policies that targeted our communities and our people back in the 80s and the 90s. So check us out 2 weeks from now, next Saturday and Sunday, 2 Saturdays and Sundays from now. I will deep dive into what that new legislation is, but you know, folks, that's why it's important to have people that can not only sympathize but empathize. If you followed our Civics Saturday Night Live and Civics Sunday Night Live last time around, you'll know exactly what I mean when I say that. So this is why it's important to have people that can not only empathize but sympathize, that represent us, because then they can make necessary changes to make sure that our people are straight for the present and the future. So again, do your homework on everything I'm talking about. Look up War on Drugs, Richard Nixon, Reaganomics. Look all these things up. Check us out in 2 weeks, where we will be talking further about the new legislation that's supposed to reverse all of those policies that was targeted towards our people, which is the stop and frisk searches and the stop and frisk searches and the mandatory minimums. All right. So I appreciate y'all, man. Don't forget, positivity is the new gangster. All right. We see y'all in 2 weeks. Thanks for joining. Peace.